So I think to get briefly into the history of peace movements, I think we have to dismiss some other popular myths that might be promoted by what I'm going to say. And for one thing, it is not the fact that peace movements are relatively new in the world is not an indication that war used to be the norm and everybody engaged in war and everybody supported war and then peace started to be developed. In human history, and particularly in human prehistory, which was much longer than human history, there's a great deal of evidence that peace has been the norm. And certainly peaceful conflict resolution predates war becoming anything like what it has become today.
I do have a question, or interject, please. So I think that the reason why I was in between saying that war is justified on all levels and not, because I think that is probably the idea that it's a learned behavior, or the only way that people saw that we could actually push for an agenda or overcome a certain movement or something like that. So the idea is that war was the only viable option at the time in order to be able to move forward for progress, or...
Okay, so the question is...
I'm going to repeat. I want people to write their questions down. We're not going to get to this material, okay?
Okay, yeah.
Please.
To try to be clear, the question is whether we should allow any wars in the future. We, ourselves, is not whether we condemn and feel ourselves superior to people who have supported wars in the past, including ourselves. The question is whether we think that wars should be justified or not, and whether we're going to do anything to try to prevent them. We certainly, it is very, very good to sing and dance and say that war is good for absolutely nothing. But there are ways we can act on that if we really understand it and believe it, and there are ways we can persuade other people of it and persuade them to actions that often have successes, right? When Obama wanted to bomb every inch of Syria 5 years ago, it was largely popular pressure that prevented that. When they wanted to tear up the Iran agreement and bomb Iran in 2015, when they wanted to bomb Iran in 2007, it was largely public pressure that prevented that. Right? When Burlington, Vermont voted last week to say no to having the F-35 based in their city, it was exclusively public pressure that created that. So we are against an incredible uphill fight. We often lose, but we are not completely impotent and powerless, and it matters a great deal what we do, and the potential to do a great deal more is, inches away, and so it matters. And so the notion that people didn't know any better, so we should excuse them having fought wars in the past, is not something I really want to argue about or care that much about if we've got the right ideas going forward. But, it really doesn't stand up. When you look at the colonies in the United States, and you see them as immediately engaging in settler colonialism and genocide, you have to blind yourself to Pennsylvania, which was created by Quakers, which respected Native Americans, which did not wage war, which invested in Philadelphia, which grew beyond the size of New York or anywhere else because they weren't dumping their resources into war. You have to ignore, these trends. When you imagine that, well, it was good to win independence from England through a war that was necessary because otherwise you wouldn't be independent from England, and we should name towns even Independence. Well, first of all, you have to shut out that other 96% of humanity as if it doesn't exist and say, who wants to look at how Canada is better or worse for not having, or Australia is better or worse for not having a war of independence against England. But you also have to blind yourself to what all the colonists were doing in very Gandhian methods prior to turning to violence. The committees that were set up, the alternative governments, the boycotts, the tea parties, the nonviolent actions of all variety that were gaining strength in the U.S. colonies before the turn to violence, which was largely a turn taken by the wealthiest oligarchs of the U.S. colonies. When you're told, oh well, you have to have war because war ended slavery, again, you have to pretend the rest of the earth doesn't exist, right? The end of slavery and serfdom was a remarkable global trend that in essentially a century or so went from 3/4 of the world being slaves or serfs to very few people being slaves or serfs. This was a global movement, and almost nowhere did it involve a bloody civil war. Right? So the notion that you must have wars because you can connect those wars to good results, doesn't hold up. So early peace movements there were always peace movements back through every period of history, and in great measure in just the period of history, but. Really in the 19th century in the United States and Europe, you started to have organized things that we would call peace movements. The arguments that some people made at the time about those peace movements, that they were wiser and more pragmatic to just oppose certain wars, not try to shut down all militarism and oppose every war and so forth. Because there was always this big dispute between sort of the pure religious-driven people who said, I'm just against all violence because that's what God tells me, and the people who said, well, we should just oppose a war on Mexico but not talk about all other wars because who knows, there might be a good one. I actually think those arguments made more sense in that pre-nuclear, pre-military industrial complex, pre-empire world. I mean, the military-industrial complex did not exist, and the business interests were against wars right up through World War I, and so we live in a different age where every day that goes by with nuclear weapons continuing to exist, especially when you have your government, the U.S. government, sending missiles at essentially Syria and Russia, another nuclear government, and the so-called opposition and resistance party in the United States having spent the past year trying to make that happen, trying to instigate a fight with another nuclear government. We risk ceasing to exist. So this is not the 19th century, but there are things we can learn from the anti-imperialism of the 1890s that really tried to stop this U.S. imperialism going beyond this continent, and did so in wise ways, even though they didn't succeed. They made very clear for posterity that every war has been a choice, that there's no such thing as a last resort or being forced into a war, that you have to very, very carefully go about avoiding peace. And I think World War I was a major turning point in peace movements because it created the military-industrial complex, it created war machines that have not shut down, but it also created peace movements, the like of which we've never seen before or since. We do think of the 1960s and early 70s, the energy of the U.S. peace movement that in many ways outstripped what we've seen since. But it didn't compare to the mainstream, popular, powerful peace movements of the 1920s and 1930s, when you had a majority in opinion polls, which now were a new thing in the United States, wanting to abolish all war, wanting global government, wanting to ban profiteering on war, which was absolutely shameful, and now, will get you on the cover of Time magazine. War profiteering in the 20s and 30s and even later was what, for-profit prison profiteering was not that long ago. So you had, after World War I, and this is what I look at in the book that Laura mentioned, When the World Outlawed War. In World War I, you had this propaganda machine created that has never shut down, that sold people on the idea that this was a war for peace, a war to end all war. And you had people who never believed that. But both groups wanted to make it true once World War I was over, wanted it to have been the last war, wanted to end all war, and tried to create world government with the League of Nations, tried to create disarmament agreements with disarmament conferences, tried to create laws against war, and so forth. Without, as Laura has reprimanded us, without starting an open discussion yet, raise your hand if you think wars can ever be legal.